The sound of cicadas buzzed through the warm evening air as I sat out on my porch, sipping a glass of iced tea and watching the last of the sun sink behind the rooftops. Life in this suburban neighborhood was supposed to be quiet, peaceful, predictable. That was the entire point of buying my place out here. No city chaos, no blaring sirens at night, no drama. Just the hum of crickets, the smell of fresh-cut lawns, and the security of knowing that my Jeep was locked safe and sound behind my gate. That Jeep meant more to me than just wheels. To most people, it looked like a rugged off-road vehicle, maybe a little too tough-looking for the cookie-cutter aesthetics of our HOA neighborhood. To me, it was a lifeline. I kept it maintained, polished, ready at a moment's notice. It wasn't just mine, either. It was tied to something far bigger than this block, something I couldn't exactly advertise openly. What I could say, though, was this. I guarded it like gold. The HOA had never liked that Jeep. Or more accurately, Karen never liked that Jeep. Karen, our HOA president, seemed to thrive on control. If she wasn't sending out violation notices about lawn height or mailbox paint, she was prowling the streets like a hawk, jotting down plates and snapping pictures of non-compliant trash cans. Everyone joked about her being the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood, but when her clipboard came out, those jokes turned nervous. She had fined people for patio chairs being the wrong shade of beige, for hanging wind chimes that disrupted harmony, even for having a basketball hoop visible from the street. And for some reason, my Jeep had become her latest obsession. She called it an eyesore. She said it cheapened the neighborhood's image. She even claimed it was parked illegally, though it sat firmly in my driveway behind my locked gate. Each notice she posted to my door grew nastier. At first, I tried reasoning with her. I explained that the Jeep wasn't a project car, wasn't abandoned, and wasn't violating any actual bylaws. It was clean, functional, and insured. But Karen's eyes lit up with every argument like she had just found another button to push. Her lips would twist into that smug little smirk, and she'd say things like, "Rules are rules. Maybe this isn't the right community for you." Most neighbors avoided her wrath, keeping their heads down and yards trimmed to within an inch of their lives. But I wasn't about to cave. That Jeep wasn't going anywhere. Still, I felt the tension tightening week by week. My gut told me she was gearing up for something bigger. I responded the way any reasonable person would. I bought a heavy-duty lock for the gate and reinforced the chain across it. I wasn't just protecting against vandalism. I was protecting the integrity of what that Jeep was tied to. Every click of the padlock reassured me. She might hate it, but she couldn't touch it. For a while, it seemed to work. Karen's nasty notes continued, but the Jeep remained right where it belonged. Days passed, then weeks. I almost allowed myself to believe the storm had passed, that maybe she had turned her laser focus onto someone else's hedges or driveway cracks. But then came that night. It was a Tuesday, late enough that most of the block had gone quiet. My TV murmured in the background as I sorted through some paperwork, the Jeep's keys resting on the table beside me. That's when I heard it. A metallic snap. The kind of sound that doesn't belong in the middle of a calm night. My ears perked instantly. Another snap, sharper this time, followed by the squeal of stressed metal giving way. I knew that sound. Bolt cutters. My heart kicked into overdrive. I dashed to the window, pulling the blinds back just enough to see. There she was. Karen, in her pressed slacks and pastel blouse, standing at my gate with a pair of bolt cutters clamped between her hands. The chain I had secured so carefully dangled useless at her feet, split clean through. The padlock lay discarded on the grass. For a split second, I froze in disbelief. Who does that? Who takes it upon themselves to break a lock that isn't theirs in the dead of night? But before my brain could catch up, she had already shoved the gate wide open. I flung the door open and stormed down the porch steps, shouting her name. She didn't flinch. Her eyes were locked on the Jeep like a predator spotting prey. She strode forward with the kind of self-righteous determination I had seen in her countless HOA speeches. "You've had enough warnings," she barked, loud enough for her voice to echo down the street. "This vehicle is in violation and it's being removed." My jaw dropped. "Removed?" I shouted back. "That's my property. You have no right." But she was already climbing into the driver's seat, fumbling with the keys she must have thought were inside. When she realized the ignition was bare, she turned her glare on me, lips curling like she had been personally insulted. "You can give me the keys or we'll escalate this officially," she snapped. Her voice carried the tone of authority. but I saw the flicker of doubt in her eyes when she realized I wasn't backing down. "This isn't a violation," I shot back, my voice rising with every word. "That Jeep is registered, insured, and absolutely none of your business. Put the cutters down and get off my property before you regret it." But Karen wasn't one to walk away, not when she thought she had the upper hand. She yanked her phone from her pocket, threatening to document my refusal, then started dialing someone on speaker, maybe another HOA board member, maybe her husband, maybe whoever she thought could back her up. Neighbors began to stir, lights flicked on, blinds shifted and doors cracked open up and down the block. Whispers floated on the breeze. People peered out, clutching mugs of tea, their eyes wide at the sight of the HOA president caught red-handed in the middle of the night with bolt cutters and a stolen Jeep. Karen must have felt the weight of those eyes, but instead of retreating, she doubled down. "This is for the good of the community," she announced loudly as if making a speech. "We cannot tolerate violations that bring down our property values." She reached back for the bolt cutters, tossing them into the passenger seat, then slid her hands across the wheel like she was claiming it. The audacity was staggering. This wasn't just a power trip. This was theft unfolding in real time. My blood boiled as adrenaline surged through me. I could feel my fists clench, my teeth grinding. I wanted to drag her out myself, but some part of me held back. Not because she didn't deserve it, she did, but because I knew the bigger picture. That Jeep wasn't just a vehicle. Inside its compartments were items tied directly to operations she couldn't begin to understand. It was part of something larger, something she had absolutely no clearance for, and now she was tampering with it. If she managed to drive off even a short distance, she'd be interfering with more than just me. She'd be interfering with law enforcement. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and dialed a number I had hoped I'd never need in this context. My voice was low, clipped, urgent as I explained the situation. The dispatcher's tone changed immediately when I gave them the vehicle's plate number and registration. The weight of what Karen was about to unleash was setting in, and I could see her arrogance blind her from the storm she had just called down upon herself. She still thought this was an HOA issue, a petty neighborhood squabble, but I knew better. I knew that by cutting that lock and setting foot inside that Jeep, she had crossed into dangerous territory. I ended the call, heart hammering in my chest, and stared at her through the windshield. She smirked like she thought I'd just called her bluff. What she didn't know was that backup was already on the way. The minutes between that phone call and the first flash of headlights felt like hours. I stood in my driveway, arms crossed, eyes locked on Karen as she sat defiantly behind the wheel of my Jeep. She tapped the steering wheel with her manicured nails, glancing at me every few seconds with that infuriating smirk plastered on her face. Neighbors had gathered more openly now, some clustered on porches, others standing on sidewalks with arms folded and phones raised to capture the spectacle. A few whispered among themselves, shaking their heads in disbelief, but none dared step forward. Everyone knew how Karen operated. Getting in her way was asking for trouble. "You're making a mistake," I said firmly, my voice low enough that it cut through the murmurs but not loud enough for her to twist into a performance. She tilted her head and gave a condescending chuckle. "No, the mistake," she said, drawing out the word with venom, "was you thinking you could ignore HOA rules and park this monstrosity here. You've been warned. This is your consequence." She leaned back in the seat, adjusting herself like she'd already won some battle no one else even knew was happening. I clenched my jaw, biting back the dozen angry retorts clawing at my throat. Every nerve in me screamed to yank the door open and pull her out by her arm, but that would only make things worse. No, I reminded myself, this wasn't just my fight anymore. She thought she was seizing control of a neighborhood squabble. What she didn't realize was that she had just walked into a hornet's nest bigger than she could comprehend. The night deepened. The cricket's song seemed to fade, replaced by the tense hum of whispers and the occasional flash of a neighbor's phone camera. Then at last a low rumble rolled down the street. Karen straightened in the seat, glancing toward the sound. Headlights cut through the darkness, growing brighter, closer. She smirked again, clearly expecting reinforcements of her own. Maybe she thought the HOA board had rushed to her side, but when the first squad car pulled up, its light bar pulsing silently, her face faltered. Then came another behind it, and another. Within seconds, my quiet cul-de-sac was lit and flashing red and blue, washing over trimmed hedges and pastel houses, the colors reflecting sharply in the Jeep's windshield. The neighbors gasped, some ducking back inside, others leaning forward with phones raised higher, desperate to catch every second. Karen froze for a moment, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. "This is unnecessary," she stammered under her breath, though the confident edge in her voice wavered. The first officer stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, his expression unreadable as he approached. His partner followed, one hand resting near his utility belt, eyes scanning the scene. "Ma'am," the first officer said evenly, stopping just short of the Jeep. "Step out of the vehicle." His voice carried the weight of authority, the kind that silenced the whispers instantly. Karen blinked, her mouth opening and closing as she scrambled for footing. "This isn't what it looks like," she insisted, raising her chin defiantly. "I'm the president of this community's HOA. This vehicle is in violation. I was executing my duty to remove it." The officer's gaze didn't flicker. "Ma'am," he repeated slower this time, "step out of the vehicle now." The edge in his tone cut through any illusion of choice. Reluctantly, Karen shoved the door open and slid out, her heels clicking against the pavement. She folded her arms tightly across her chest, glaring at me like I had orchestrated the whole scene. "This man has been openly defying the HOA," she declared, gesturing dramatically toward me as if presenting evidence in court. "He's been warned repeatedly. His vehicle is an eyesore, it devalues our homes, and it's parked behind an illegal lock and chain. I was forced to take action on behalf of the community." The officer let her words hang in the air, then slowly turned his eyes to me. I met his gaze, steady, calm, though my pulse hammered in my ears. "Sir, do you want to explain?" he asked. I nodded once. "That's my vehicle," I said clearly, making sure the neighbors could hear too. "It's registered, insured, and secured behind my gate with a lock that she just cut open with bolt cutters. She broke into my property and attempted to steal my Jeep." Karen's laugh was sharp and brittle. "Steal? Don't be ridiculous. HOA guidelines give me authority." "Ma'am," the officer cut her off, his voice like steel. "Nothing gives you authority to cut through a private lock and enter someone's secured vehicle. Especially not this one." He exchanged a glance with his partner, and the second officer stepped closer to the Jeep, shining his flashlight across its dash and interior. Karen frowned, clearly confused. "What do you mean, especially not this one?" she asked, her voice faltering. The officer turned back to her slowly. "This Jeep," he said, his words deliberate, "is not just this man's personal property. It is assigned to a task force operation. By tampering with it, you have interfered with law enforcement equipment." The color drained from Karen's face. For the first time, her lips trembled as she struggled to find words. That can't be right," she whispered. Her eyes darted to me, searching for some sign that it was a bluff, but there was no bluff here. She had no idea how deep she had just sunk. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A few neighbors whispered loudly enough to be heard. "Did he just say task force?" one muttered. "Oh my God, Karen's in trouble," another whispered back. Phones tilted to capture her paling face, the bolt cutters gleaming incriminatingly in the Jeep's passenger seat. "I didn't know," Karen stammered, her bravado crumbling. "I thought it was just a car. An ugly car. I didn't—" "Ma'am," the officer said, his patience thinning. "Ignorance is not a defense. You cut a secured lock. You entered a vehicle that doesn't belong to you. And you interfered with property tied to ongoing police work. That is criminal behavior." Karen's hand shook as she tried to hold her arms tighter against her chest. "You can't arrest me for this," she whispered, her voice cracking. But even she didn't sound convinced. The officer signaled to his partner, who stepped forward, producing a pair of handcuffs with a practiced motion. "Turn around, ma'am," he said firmly. Karen's eyes widened, her breath quickening. "Wait, no, you can't. I'm the HOA president. I was protecting the neighborhood." She stumbled back a step, but the officer's hand guided her firmly to turn. The sound of metal clicking shut around her wrists echoed in the stunned silence of the street. The neighbors erupted in murmurs. Some covered their mouths in shock. Others whispered gleefully as if they'd been waiting years to see her knocked down. I stood still, my arms crossed, watching as Karen's shoulders slumped under the weight of reality. "You don't understand," she pleaded as the officer guided her toward the squad car. "I was just doing my job. I didn't know. You can't do this to me." But the officer's response was blunt, final. "Ma'am, your job doesn't put you above the law." She was placed in the back of the car, her face pale, eyes darting wildly as the neighbors' cameras captured every angle. The bolt cutters were bagged as evidence, the broken chain photographed. The Jeep sat there untouched now, its presence radiating authority she had underestimated. I caught the eye of one officer and he gave me a small nod. Not reassurance exactly, but acknowledgement. He knew what that Jeep represented, even if he couldn't say it out loud. I returned the nod, understanding the silent message. This was bigger than both of us, and the less said, the better. As the squad cars pulled away, taking Karen with them, the street slowly came alive with chatter. Neighbors edged closer, some daring to approach me directly. "Is it true?" one asked, eyes wide. "That Jeep's connected to the police?" I shrugged lightly, careful not to confirm or deny.
All I can say is it wasn't hers to touch. That answer was enough to fuel a storm of speculation. By the time I stepped back inside my house,
Closing the door against the buzzing night, I knew this was far from over. Karen had crossed a line that couldn't be undone, and the consequences were only just beginning. The neighborhood was buzzing the next morning like a hive that had been kicked. Word traveled faster than wildfire. By the time I stepped out onto my porch with my first cup of coffee, 3 different neighbors had already casually wandered past my yard, each trying to get a better look at the Jeep sitting quietly behind the gate. Its black finish gleamed under the early sun, lock replaced, chain tighter than before as though nothing had happened. But everything had changed. From across the street, Mrs. Porter waved like she always did, but this time her eyes lingered, hungry for details. "Crazy night, wasn't it?" she called, her voice a little too cheerful for the early hour. I gave her a polite nod, the kind of non-answer that said, "Yes, I know, but don't ask me too much." She seemed disappointed, muttered something about karma catching up with people, and shuffled on. That was how the whole block was, half shocked, half thrilled, all curious. Karen's house, however, was a fortress of silence. The blinds stayed drawn, her husband's truck missing from the driveway. Normally, she strutted the street every morning, clipboard in hand, scolding people for leaving bins out too long. But today there was nothing. Only silence and the occasional twitch of blinds when someone dared to look too long in her direction. By noon, my phone buzzed with a call. The number wasn't familiar, but I recognized the clipped tone on the other end instantly. "We need to meet," the voice said. Not a question, not a request. An instruction. 10 minutes later, a black unmarked sedan rolled up. 2 plainclothes officers stepping out. They moved with the quiet efficiency of men who didn't waste time. I led them around back where the Jeep sat. They examined the new chain, the remnants of the old lock I'd kept as proof. One officer took photos while the other asked precise questions. Where had she cut it? Did she sit inside? Did she touch anything besides the steering wheel? I answered as best I could, watching their pens scratch across notepads. Every detail mattered now. Finally, one of them sighed, closing his notebook. "She picked the wrong fight," he muttered. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. "She didn't know," I said quietly. "She didn't have to know," he replied flatly. "The second she cut that lock, she stepped into felony territory. Interference, tampering, theft. The fact that it's tied to an active task force makes it 10 times worse." He paused, eyes meeting mine. "You need to understand, this isn't just about her anymore. The HOA's going to feel this too." Sure enough, the ripples hit fast. By that evening, the HOA board had called an emergency meeting. Notices were shoved into mailboxes, printed in bold red ink like some urgent town hall announcement. It was scheduled for the next night in the community center. The words incident, misunderstanding, and clarification were peppered throughout. I smirked when I read it. They weren't calling that meeting for the community. They were scrambling to save themselves. The following evening, the community center overflowed. I had never seen so many neighbors show up at once. Normally, HOA meetings dragged on with barely a dozen people half asleep in metal folding chairs while Karen droned about landscaping rules. But tonight, every chair was filled. People lined the walls and the air buzzed with tension. The board members sat at their long table up front, faces pale, papers shuffled nervously. Karen wasn't there. Her absence was louder than her presence had ever been. At the center sat Rick, the vice president, who looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight. He cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and launched into a speech. "Neighbors, thank you for coming on such short notice," he began, his voice shaky. As you may have heard, there was an incident last night involving a misunderstanding over vehicle regulations and property security. Murmurs rippled instantly. Misunderstanding? Someone scoffed loudly from the back. Rick plowed forward, sweat beading his forehead. The board wants to assure you that the HOA remains committed to fairness, safety, and the integrity of our community. From my seat near the middle, I could feel the collective skepticism rising. Eyes rolled, arms folded. The board was stalling. Finally, a hand shot up. Mr. Daniels, who had lived here 20 years, longer than anyone. He didn't wait to be called on. Cutting someone's lock in the middle of the night is not a misunderstanding, he barked. That's breaking and entering. That's theft. We all saw the police cars. We all saw her in cuffs. Don't you dare stand there and downplay this. Applause broke out around him. Rick's composure cracked. He stammered, fumbling with his papers. Well, yes, but nothing, a woman shouted from the side. She humiliated all of us. The whole street's talking about it. The cops said it was a police vehicle. What kind of idiot messes with that? All eyes turned to me then, dozens of pairs burning into my skin. I shifted uncomfortably. I hadn't wanted the spotlight, but there it was, glaring and hot. Do you want to say something? Rick asked reluctantly, as if dreading the answer. I stood slowly, clearing my throat. Look, I began, keeping my voice calm, steady. This isn't about me versus Karen, this is about boundaries. She crossed one. A big one. That Jeep was locked behind my gate on my property. She had no right to touch it. And when she did, she wasn't just messing with me. She was interfering with something far bigger than she could imagine. Gasps and murmurs filled the air. People leaned forward, hungry for details. I didn't give them more than that. The point is, what happened last night wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. It was a crime. And pretending otherwise is insulting to every one of us who's been on the receiving end of her power trips. The room erupted in applause. Some people even stood. The board members exchanged panicked glances, their carefully crafted narrative collapsing like a house of cards. Rick tried to regain control, but the crowd wasn't having it. One by one, neighbors stood to vent years of frustration. Fines for silly things, harassment over minor details, threats of liens and penalties. The floodgates opened, and suddenly, Karen wasn't the powerful president anymore. She was the villain of every story, the symbol of everything wrong with the HOA. By the time the meeting adjourned, one thing was clear: Karen's reign was over. Whether she resigned or was voted out, she wasn't coming back. Not after this, but her troubles were just beginning. Over the next week, I learned bits and pieces from whispers and rumors. She had been formally charged. Interference with law enforcement property, attempted theft, criminal mischief. The exact charges shifted depending on who you asked. But the bottom line was the same. Karen wasn't wriggling out of this with a stern warning or a fine. Her husband tried to play damage control, insisting it was all a misunderstanding, that she had acted in the community's best interest. But no one bought it. The neighbors avoided their house like it was radioactive. Kids whispered and pointed as they biked past. Delivery drivers laughed about the lady who stole a cop car. One evening, I spotted Karen herself in the driveway, her posture slumped, her hair disheveled, the fire gone from her eyes. She didn't have her clipboard. She didn't bark at anyone about their trash bins. She just stood there staring blankly at the ground like a queen without a crown. For the first time, she looked small, and as much as I hated her for what she had done, a small part of me almost pitied her. Almost, because the truth was, she had done this to herself. She had believed her power as HOA president was limitless. She had believed she could bend rules, break locks, and trespass without consequence. She had believed she was untouchable. And now, reality had come crashing down. The Jeep, meanwhile, sat safely behind my reinforced gate, its presence a silent reminder of the chaos it had caused. But it wasn't the Jeep's fault. It wasn't even about the Jeep. It was about control, about ego, about one woman's obsession with power and her failure to realize that power ends where the law begins. The story should have ended there. But Karen wasn't finished yet. The trial didn't happen overnight. That was the hardest part. The waiting. Weeks stretched into months, and life in the neighborhood settled into an uneasy rhythm. The Jeep stayed parked behind my gate, chained and locked with reinforced steel. I didn't drive it unless absolutely necessary. Every time I looked at it, I was reminded of that night Karen decided she had more authority than the law itself. Karen's absence was felt immediately. No more clipboard patrols, no more petty fines, no more thinly veiled threats about lawn heights or mailbox paint. At first, the neighborhood felt like it was breathing fresh air for the first time in years. People chatted more freely in their driveways, kids played later into the evenings, and the community seemed lighter. But every so often, whispers would surface. About Karen, about her case, about what the police had said. Her house became a dark blot on the street. Curtains drawn, cars rarely moving, the family retreating into themselves. Her husband avoided eye contact, his shoulders slumped, as if the whole world were watching him. The children, once loud and rowdy, now kept to their backyard. It was as though the family had been exiled in plain sight. I tried not to dwell on it, but the story wouldn't leave me alone. At the grocery store, strangers would whisper, "That's him, that's the guy with the Jeep." At work, coworkers teased me about being the guy Karen tried to steal from. Even family members called to laugh about it. What was once a source of rage became almost surreal, like I was living in some bizarre sitcom where the neighborhood tyrant had been caught in the dumbest possible crime. But I knew the gravity. I knew what that Jeep represented. And I knew this wasn't a comedy. It was real. The summons came in the mail one gray morning, a thick envelope that carried the weight of inevitability. I had been called as a witness. My stomach clenched as I read through the paperwork. Karen's trial date was set. She was officially being charged with felony criminal mischief, attempted theft of government property, and obstruction of an investigation. Heavy words. Words that didn't leave much room for leniency. The courthouse was packed the day of the trial. Local reporters had caught wind of the story. HOA president accused of trying to steal police jeep was too juicy for them to resist. Cameras flashed outside, microphones shoved toward anyone willing to talk. I kept my head down, slipping inside quietly. When I finally saw her again, sitting at the defense table, I almost didn't recognize her. The woman who once strutted down the street like a self-appointed queen looked deflated. Her hair, usually styled to perfection, hung limp. Her face was pale, lined with exhaustion. The fire in her eyes had been replaced by something else. Fear. Real fear. The prosecution didn't waste time painting the picture. They called witnesses, neighbors who had seen the police haul her away, officers who testified about the lock being cut, about the Jeep being part of an active task force. They displayed photos, the cut chain, the damaged lock, even fingerprints pulled from the Jeep's door handle. Piece by piece, they built the case that this wasn't a misunderstanding or a lapse in judgment. It was willful, deliberate interference. Then came my turn. I walked to the stand, nerves buzzing under my skin. The oath was administered, and then the prosecutor began with calm, steady questions. Where was the Jeep parked? Whose lock was cut? Did I give Karen permission? I answered simply, truthfully. My words felt heavy in the silent courtroom. When it came time for the defense to cross-examine, Karen's lawyer tried to twist the narrative. He suggested Karen was acting in the interest of community safety, that she believed the Jeep was an abandoned vehicle violating HOA rules. But the more he spoke, the weaker the argument sounded. I pointed out firmly that the Jeep was behind my locked gate, not on public display, not abandoned, not anyone's business but mine. At one point, I glanced over at Karen. Our eyes met briefly. Hers were wide, almost pleading, but I looked away. There was nothing left to say. The trial stretched over 3 days, but the outcome was never in doubt. When the jury returned, the foreman's voice was clear. Guilty on all counts. The gasp that went through the courtroom was followed by silence. Karen's head dropped into her hands. Her husband slumped in his seat. The judge announced sentencing would follow in a few weeks, but the verdict itself was enough. Karen, the self-proclaimed enforcer of rules, had been judged by a higher authority and found wanting. The weeks that followed were strange. Some neighbors celebrated openly, throwing thinly veiled good riddance parties. Others were quieter, uncomfortable with how far things had gone. I stayed somewhere in the middle. Justice had been served, yes, but there was no joy in watching a neighbor, no matter how unbearable, fall so hard. When sentencing day arrived, I didn't attend. I read about it later in the paper. She was given 2 years probation, a hefty fine, mandatory community service, and perhaps most painful of all, banned from holding any leadership role in an HOA for life. Her empire had crumbled. After that, life slowly returned to normal. A new board was elected, one that actually listened to the residents instead of lording over them. Rules became more reasonable, and for the first time, people felt like the HOA existed for them, not against them. Karen's house eventually went up for sale. The family moved away quietly without farewell parties or goodbyes. One day the curtains were just open again, the driveway empty, the house hollow. A young couple bought it a month later, bringing with them laughter, plants, and an energy that reminded everyone how a community should feel. As for me, the Jeep remained part of my life, though its meaning shifted. It wasn't just a vehicle anymore, it was a reminder of how fragile power can be, how quickly arrogance can unravel, how easily someone can lose everything by overstepping their bounds. Sometimes, when I start it up, I think back to that night, the sound of metal snapping, the flashing lights, Karen's stunned expression when the handcuffs clicked around her wrists. I think about the irony, the sheer absurdity of it all. A woman who had spent years cutting down others finally cut something she couldn't fix. And every time, I remind myself of one simple truth: no one, not even an HOA president drunk on power, is above the law.